Hello, and welcome back to the second season of the SecurityMetrics Podcast. I'm Jen Stone. I'm a principal security analyst here at SecurityMetrics, and I've been told I'm supposed to say a little bit more about what that means. Security analyst can mean a lot of things, but for me, it means I'm part of the audit team. I perform audits for PCI, HIPAA, HITRUST. But what this means is I have a lot of interest in security, compliance, and privacy, and I love this podcast because it means I get to talk really cool people about what they know and you get to listen in on it. So if you have any specific people or interests that you'd like to hear on the podcast, shoot them our way. We would love to make that happen for you. Today, we have Ross Young, CISO of Caterpillar Financial Services Corporation, SANS instructor, Johns Hopkins University instructor, CISO Tradecraft podcast co-host. That's where I actually heard him originally. It's a great podcast. And creator of the OWASP Threat and Safeguard Matrix, or TASM. So you have a few things going on in your life. Can you tell us a little bit more about you, your background, your education, how you got to where you are currently in your career?
Sure, I'll go from the start. I did a computer science degree and a business degree at Utah State University. Go Aggies!
Good school.
Afterwards, I did a MBA in cybersecurity at Idaho State.
Okay.
And it was one of the first programs that really focused on creating CISOs, where most programs were computer science heavy and doing masters in that or a master's in engineering. This wanted to focus on the InfoSec leadership. So I did that, and halfway through, I was doing an internship at the National Security Agency and had a great time. And then afterwards, I spent about a year doing IT audits at the Federal Reserve Board. So we would go and audit the 12 federal banks and have a really good time. And then
that sounds exciting. That sounds hard, actually. Interesting.
Yeah, it was really interesting because it's an organization where it's very regulated, but also a lot of opportunities to learn some best practices and standardization. I have never seen an organization more audited than the Federal Reserve.
Interesting. Well, that's probably good.
Yeah, so it taught me a lot of really good things. And then I had fun at CIA for about 10 and a half years before going to the commercial sector.
Fantastic. And so how long have you been with Caterpillar?
I've been there since this June, so a little over 6-7 months there. Very,
very cool. So like I said earlier, I first heard you on the CISO Tradecraft podcast. I love listening to other security shows out there that are related to our field because there's so many great perspectives on how do we adequately protect information? How do we meet these expectations that people have of us in terms of compliance, security, privacy? And I love what you have to say there with G. Mark Hardy. Did I get his name right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yay.
G. Mark is a fantastic co-host. I couldn't have a better partner to do the show with. And we just really love trying to mentor the next generation of CISOs and help people increase their security tradecraft.
And it seems like that's what that podcast is all about, helping people grow into that CISO role. What made you feel like that was a niche that you wanted to fill with your conversations there?
Well, I think there's a lot of shows that teach people how to be more technical. And I think there's another type of shows where they're doing a lot of the news, but I didn't really see a lot of mentoring and personal coaching. And what I wanted to do was provide that legacy because I didn't find a lot of places where I could find that easily. And as I started moving and introducing myself to more and more people, I wanted to have the way to mentor at scale. And so I wanted to record and leave these lessons to help other people going through the ranks where I was just a few years ago.
So basically, understanding the struggle that you had is really informing the conversation there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So as a CISO, we should probably step back a little bit and tell people, we have a lot of different people from a lot of different areas of the industry who listen to this. And some of them might not know, they might be familiar with what a CISO kind of is, but maybe you could fill us in a little bit more on what is that role? What is Where do they fit in the organization, and what do they do?
So the Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, is the head person in charge of everything cyber within a corporation. And it's a role that's kind of transitioned. It used to always report to the CIO, the head of the IT. And it's starting to morph to see where it goes. It goes under risk sometimes, it goes straight to the CEO, but it's really about a couple of things. It's about being able to safeguard and enable the business to take risks. It's about being able to provide a security vigilance and security awareness training to an organization, and really also meeting all of the regulatory compliance frameworks so that you can be a sound business operating in whichever sector that you're doing.
I really like your focus on CISO helping enable the business to deal with risk. And as an auditor, a lot of times I'll get asked, can I do this? Can I do this? Will this meet that? There's a lot of room in compliance audits against certain standards for judgment. And sometimes I will hear some of my colleagues will say, no, I give them this answer and this answer and this answer because it's what they're comfortable with. It's what they're familiar with. But I think maybe a better approach, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, is I like to help organizations understand risk as well. I think that's one of the most important things that an assessor can do. And then the business needs to make a decision depending on their risk appetite. Because as an assessor, I don't know that. But I think a CISO is uniquely informed, not only what their risk profile might be, but also what their risk appetite might be. Can you help me kind of fill in the blanks on that for how a CISO might speak to C-levels or boards or that in terms of risk?
Yeah, so when you think about risk, there's a typical risk matrix that you have. On one side, you have a likelihood of attack, and this may be how many times per year you expect something to occur. And on the other side, you'll have a severity or consequences, which is how much damage can this cause? And often we put these in terms of dollars. So imagine a system, and let's just say it has personal information within it. And we assess based off of, Verizon data breach records that each record may be worth $150. And then if you say, well, if there's 1,000 records in here, it's worth $150,000 for the system if it were compromised and those records were lost. And then you want to look at the attributes around the system and say, well, this is unpatched and here's some problems why we can't get this to the desired state. So that allows us to understand a system and being able to categorize, we think it's this opportunity and this amount of damage that could happen. And here's your options, business. You can patch it and remediate it. You can, just accept the risk and move on. You can transfer the risk. So maybe you take out some type of a insurance policy, or you really allow the organization to make the decisions. Because as a cyber organization, we're not the hands on the keyboard developers who have to make the patches. So we are more of the consulting piece where we identify things, show them, and allow the business to make their decisions based off information that helps them.
So as a CISO, how often do you think you do formal risk assessment activities with your team?
I think that's going to happen all of the time, right? And it just depends on what level of risk assessment we're talking about. If we're talking about of the cyber program as a whole, that may be something that happens once a year. If we're talking about a assessment on a financially significant application, it depends to where the policy is. Are we going to review this on a quarterly basis, a yearly basis? It depends on how frequently they're changing the code base and releasing new software.
So looking at it from the other direction, when you as a CISO need to speak to other C-levels or to a board of directors about cybersecurity risk, how do you shape that conversation? Are they able to take on board the things that you're saying to them?
So I think you have to view cyber as one piece of risk along with so many others. And typically, you form a risk committee, and it may be headed by a chief risk officer or the CISO. But what you're really talking about is how do we standardize the list of risks? And if we go back to having that risk matrix, we may prioritize, what are the top 10 highest risks in the company? And then afterwards, when you have those risks and you bring them forward, you need to talk about a plan. And the plan should articulate, okay, how are we going to identify the risk, protect, detect, respond, and recover against this threat? And how do we want to measure to show if the plan is actually working? And if you build those sorts of metrics and take that back to the risk committee, I think they're very interested to see how you can measure progress and you can show a system is working to reduce the risk in an organization.
One of the things that you mentioned just a few minutes ago was that sometimes, and actually I think it's more common in the past, and this is probably already changing, the CISO used to report to the CIO, but that is not as common anymore. And I have a theory. Tell me if I'm wrong. I think it's because the CIO is more in charge of making things work, making the business functions function through the computer systems, where the CISO is, all right, it can work, but it needs to be done in a secure way. And often those are two perspectives that might come into conflict with each other, where if you have a single individual responsible for making things work, you're going to be kind of personally incentivized not to focus as much on the security things if that slows that down. That's just my theory, though. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so any good CIO understands confidentiality, integrity, and availability and really tries to ensure all of those things are happening. And a CISO is trying to be a good advisor and help that individual with their pieces of what they're trying to accomplish. But ultimately, there's going to come a time where here's a system that is insecure by whatever reason, and we feel like it poses a risk to the environment. Now, the question is, we have to think about things a little bit larger in scope in terms of business. Let's say this system brings in $2 million every year to the company, but is still running on very old, unpatched software because the vendor who sold us this bill of goods went out of business. Well, that's a risk trade-off question, right? Do I want the money of this potentially important application, or do I need to find a way to fix it, which might take away from my ability to accrue $2 million a year? And in those things, that's where it's hard, because if the CISO is pushing that piece and he reports directly to the CIO, sometimes it can be a conflict of interest, right? So you've seen that shift start to put them under a variety of different places, under the chief finance officer to the CEO, and every place has trade-offs. There is no perfect place to put a CISO. And one of the reasons I will also say is really good to still have a CISO under the CIO is because then you'll have more frequent meetings with all the other direct reports to the CIO, which can help allow you to move more your security efforts when you just have more time on target with individuals to understand where they're going. So there's no one size fits all. You have to figure out what works for your organization, but pros and cons each way.
It sounds like communication is a big piece of that, regardless of where the CISO sits.
Definitely. Having good relationship with your peers and your bosses is important for any role.
How do you think clarity on the mission of the organization assists in clarity on how to address security issues?
Well, I think you have to set the standard. And if you set a standard that says we are going to comply with all laws and regulations first, and we're a good, strong, ethical company, that's going to force a certain behavior. Versus if you say, hey, we're all about revenue, that's a very different company with a different motivation. And now when we have those two systems in play and you're violating payment card industry standards, Well, the first company, it's very clear to say, hey, this is what our CEO is telling us and leading us. I think we have a certain mission to live our values and follow that. Versus the second one, it's profit driven, right?
Hmm.
And not to say that companies would do dishonest things, but there's not that focus in terms of doing the right thing.
Right. I often see that in different organizations that have that different focus. And like you say, the ones that are profit driven, it's not that they are dishonest. It's that they might look at PCI, which is a great example, as something that's getting in their way, something that has to be done, but they're not super excited about it. Where other organizations that are more focused on the laws and the compliance and those standards and things, might say, this is important to us and we're going to put a little more focus to it. But in some cases, they actually will go beyond the standard in some of their security. And I think that it again speaks to kind of the culture of the organization and the risk appetite that they have.
Yeah, I see this as a different view of opinions, right? Is cyber a key enabler for their business? Is it a competitive edge factor that they can leverage? Or is it a cost center? And both approaches are valid, right?
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully we'll start to see that if the core business of your organization is software development, then it should probably be a competitive factor for
Yeah.
you to drive that. But if your core mission is healthcare and you're really focused on patient care and more the services, and IT is just a small subset of that, perhaps it's a very different enabler for your mission.
It's an interesting thought. So sometimes I'll have conversations with people who are more frontline, sysadmins, network administrators, people who are doing work and who are very focused on a very specific thing, and who know of potential vulnerabilities in their systems that they don't know really how to speak to the CISO about it. Like they're almost too removed to bring this up as a concern, or maybe the CISO knows it's a concern, but hasn't communicated to them what the risk appetite is, how they're going to approach things. In your experience working with other people on your team, people who are maybe frontline workers, how can you help them with that communication?
I think we have to bring our communications up to the right level. If you're going to an executive, they're probably going to care about three things. One is mission impact or business impact, and that's often shown in terms of dollars, right? How do we deliver this core function of what our company is built around? The second piece is costs, right? They
Mm-hmm.
need to understand it. You're driven by costs everywhere because that drives resource constraints. And then the third piece is risk, right? And so as
Mm-hmm.
long as we can speak in one of those three areas, then we have a story that they'll want to listen to. And then you need to understand what are all the reasons why this may or may not work. It may be a risk, but it may be a very expensive risk, and it's the bottom thing out of the top 10 priorities that somebody is focused on. Well, that's probably not going to go that far. But if it's a very big risk with very big dollars assigned to when it goes bad and a high likelihood, now I have a chance of really catching somebody's ear.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like that there needs to be an understanding of what is it the person is listening for. To what degree are they going to have the appetite for your question in the first place? In my past career, I started off on the help desk many years ago, and would occasionally find myself in the elevator with the CEO, who would say to me, "What's going on in your world?" And mostly I was like, I don't even know what to tell you. because a lot of help desk is just break fix, right? There's something going on all the time. But in what way does that affect him, or would that inform his decision making? I don't know. I'm pretty sure he was just being nice. But I do run into people who ask me that question. How do I speak this concern that I have at the right level? And it sounds to me like maybe they're trying to take it to the wrong person, or they're phrasing it in a way that is not meaningful to the person that they're trying to take it to.
Yeah, you definitely want to tell someone a message they need to hear in a way they want to hear it so that it will be well received.
So it sounds like you do a lot of mentoring because the podcast is obviously a broad net mentoring. But do you also mentor specific people, just individuals that are part of maybe a closer circle that you have?
I do. I do. I have a number of friends that I've connected with over my careers, and I try to give them advice that's tailorable to where they're trying to go. So it's about understanding what they want. Not everybody wants to be a CISO. Other people are just happy, being a independent contributor or having a technical role. So understanding their personal needs and then providing the right advice that can help them. And a lot of times it's the visualization of, okay, let's talk about where you want to go and what path gets you there. And you can't always know that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows that here's the one proven path that gets you there, but you can say, I've seen this more likely to succeed than these other options. And so you can only take the options that are presented to you at that moment in time. And how do we make sure that person gets a bigger view than where they see themselves?
That's an interesting thought. So for myself, I don't have an interest in being a CISO, although talking to you, you make it sound like a much more interesting position than I previously thought. But I really enjoy being the individual contributor, but I know a lot of people would like that seat at the table, that to be able to help with the strategic implementation of needs that a CISO has. So for you, when you were walking that path yourself, were there any people who were influential in your need for a mentor, or as you were looking for advice? How did you go about finding that?
So there's no perfect mentor, right? You have to find the person that works for you. And for me, I always wanted someone who was really brutally honest with me, who didn't, fluff anything or sugarcoat stuff. When they say, hey, Ross, this is what you need, those were the people that I really enjoyed. And I just naturally gravitated to someone who had the ability to succeed through the politics of an organization and being able to provide that advice to me, because it wasn't always easy for me to understand things. And sometimes I was very much a alpha charger in doing things, but I was, burning bridges or, causing difficulties because I didn't understand the political consequences of doing things here without getting all of the buy-in and consensus up front. And so having people who could understand me as well as provide that insight on the political savviness that I was missing were some of the areas that I really found were helpful for me personally.
I think political savvy is one of the hardest things for me, has been the hardest thing to navigate. I haven't been very good at what you said, the consensus building and getting the support up front for things. My tendency has always been, well, if there's an obvious solution to this problem, let's go and do the obvious solution. But it's not always obvious to everyone. And so what are some other methods that you use to build that consensus and to gain that support for ideas that you have?
Yeah, so let me tell you the anti-pattern and then I'll tell you the more effective pattern. The anti-pattern was I would go into a meeting and I would essentially say, here's something I think we need to do. And then I just assumed everybody would say, well, that's a great idea. Let's do it.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand while I was verbally assaulting them with my idea that I thought was really powerful. Instead, what I learned to do was go and meet with each of those individuals one-on-one, have a nice get to know you lunch and kind of see where they're focused on and what their priorities were, and see if this would align to some of their interests. And then as I was able to do that and kind of build those relationships of trust, then they were able to help me in return. And that's part of the like Dale Carnegie win friends and influence people strategy of
Right.
help people first and then they kind of help you back. And as I started doing more of that, instead of just going in one meeting and expecting everything to happen, maybe it took me, 3 weeks of politicking to making sure that happens. But then everybody had already agreed to this before the meeting even happens. And the meeting was just there to document the acceptance.
Interesting. So, as a CISO, what is your favorite part of the role? What do you enjoy most about that job?
So sometimes when I was looking, and this might be a little bit of hubris for me, I used to say, man, I think I could make a better decision, or I'd love to be able to control things. So what I love most about the CISO role is you have the ability to set the strategic direction of what to focus on. And there's so many things a cyber organization has to deliver, from product security to third-party risk assessments to auditor and compliance. You get to choose where the resources are directed. And that's what I really enjoy about that. And I also love how you have the ability to coach and mentor a lot of the other folks who work for you or part of the organization to help them live their dreams and help them have the good managers and leaders that you would have wanted when you were in those positions.
That's a good answer. So I took us in a completely different direction from what I told you we were going to talk about, but I just have found it's fascinating, the development of a CISO, what they can do and how to get there. And I'm sure that we have a lot of listeners who are interested in taking on that role at some point. So I appreciate you sharing so many personal insights into that experience. Just to kind of regroup to what the original questions were before we close. Where do you see the CISO role going in the future? You shared with me, and we'll put it in the show notes, a beautiful mapping that Sunil, you did, the mapping of the CISO evolution to the NIST cybersecurity framework. Thought it was very, very interesting, and it takes us kind of up to today. But what do you see a future CISO role looking like?
I think we're going to see the CISO role pivot to take on a lot of the lessons from legal and finance. And this is really where we're seeing the shift, right? If you look over the past couple of years, almost every major organization I see now taking a financial position to quantify a risk in terms of likelihood and dollars and impact. You see the FAIR method being used significantly to drive those numbers.
Yeah.
And from the legal perspective is another interesting angle, right? People don't go to a legal organization and say, wow, that's so expensive. And how many legal officers do we have in this company? But they do that with cyber all the time, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But you always go to your legal officer to say, can I do this? Is this the smart thing? And they're very well respected and helpful in making business decisions. And I think we're going to see a little bit more of that going in the future from cyber.
Well, is there anything else you want to share with people about the nature of the CISO role, or any that I skipped over or neglected at this point?
Well, I think it's one of the most dynamic roles. It's changing all of the time. And there's no one CISO role. Every company is different. The way you are a CISO for a small company that's a startup, you may be heavily focused on product security and building out an application. Versus if you're in a top 10 bank, you may spend all your time with regulators and oversight committees. So there's no one role. What I will say is we try to take a lot of the lessons learned of what good CISOs do, and we put it into the CISO Tradecraft podcast. So please take a look if you're interested in learning how to become a cyber executive.
Definitely, and we will link to that podcast in the show notes as well. I have personally found it very valuable and interesting, and I've listened to every episode so far, so looking forward to everything you put out.
Thank you, Jen. And I love listening to your show, and I'm excited to see where you go because metrics and other key pieces that you talk on are very helpful as we start to look through some of the human factors and other pieces that you really tug on. I think it's great to hear other podcasts like yourself.
Well, thanks very much. I hope we get to talk again. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of SecurityMetrics Podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.